everyone. I'm told it's 1 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. I think we have quite a few people on the phone. I would also mention there's plenty of room at the table. For those of you sitting in the back, you could sit at the table. We do have microphones scattered around the table this time. Hopefully it will catch everyone a little easier. And so if you do plan on talking or ask a question and you're not near a microphone, just please move up to the microphone to speak into it so everyone can hear you, including those on the phone. Yes. Yeah. So I think we'll start off with introductions. I'm Kira Moore from the Air Pollution Control Program. Since our last meeting, I've had a job change, so technically I'm the Deputy Division Director of the Environmental Quality. So thank you. It's still new to me, so I'm still saying I'm the Air Program Director, but I am doing both roles at this time. So I'll answer to either one, and my duties will not change. I'll still be over the Air Program, even when we fill that Program Director position. So we'll go around and do introductions. Eric, you want to start on the corner there?
Sure. Eric Holder with Independence Power and Light, City of Independence. I'm the Environmental Program Supervisor with them.
Chris Winburn, City of Independence, Independence Power and Light. I'm a Energy Markets Coordinator.
I'm Pat Justice with Ameren, Missouri.
This is Emily Wilbur with the Air Pollution Control Program.
Your mic's not on.
Oh.
Catherine Warner from the City of St. Louis, Office of the Mayor.
Or try powering again. Maybe you did have it on. Have again. No, the mic.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Oh, okay.
This is Emily Wilbur with the Air Pollution Control Program. We'll go ahead and go around on the phone. Is there anybody on the phone?
Catherine Wirtz, KW Grant Services. Mona Menezes with the City of Branson.
Phone toward the mic.
Okay, is that it on the phone?
No, how about Jan Titus from St. Louis Lambert Airport?
Anybody else? All right.
Okay.
Darcy Bybee, Air Pollution Control Program. Stacy Allen with the Air Pollution Control Program.
Mark Leith with the Air Pollution Control Program.
Shelley Reimer, Air Pollution Control Program.
Richard Waters with the DNR Office of General Counsel.
Joe Pemberton, Lebanon R3 Schools, Missouri Association for Pupil Transportation.
I'm Deborah Clank with Student Transportation, Missouri Department of Education.
Jane Hines, Columbia Water and Light.
Vernon Ring, Jasper R5 Schools.
Stan Perkins, Office of Administration, State Fleet Management.
Steve Ahrens, Missouri Propane Education and Research Council.
Jay Hoskins, Metropolitan St. Louis Sewer District.
David Grimes, Southeast Missouri Regional Planning Commission.
Kevin Cheek, Midwest Bus Sales.
Susan Henderson, Moore Polsinelli.
Joe Killiam, Southeast Missouri.
Bill Weatherall, Air Quality Monitoring Section.
Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us in person and on the phone. I don't know if anyone is new to this group, but I think we have a few newer people that may not have attended a meeting. So I just kind of wanted to, and for everyone else's benefit, to recap where we are on the Volkswagen Trust. So we've been holding meetings since the end of October. We had 4 meetings, one in Jeff City and one in St. Louis, Kansas City, and Springfield, kind of introductory meetings to explain what the trust is, explain what the money can be spent on, and kind of explain the goal. And then we had a meeting in Jefferson City in December, and this is our second regular meeting of the advisory committee. Anyone can be on the advisory committee, but the meetings are open to everybody as well. So we've done a couple surveys, which is what we're going to talk about the second one today. But really the goal of these meetings is to find out what everyone wants the state of Missouri and the Department of Natural Resources how to implement this trust. We have $41 million in Missouri It can be spent on the 10 different options that are laid out in the trust that I think most of you are familiar with by now. If not, I encourage you to go to our website and look at those. We've just been gathering feedback to draft a plan. We have to, as the beneficiary for the state of Missouri, the Department of Natural Resources needs to draft a beneficiary mitigation plan to submit to the trustee. Our tentative goal on that is to submit that draft plan for public comment, which is a requirement of the trust, sometime in March. We may meet that deadline and we may not, but we are working towards that goal. But again, we want to hear from you and gather input on how Missouri should spend that money. So through these meetings, through the comment portal on the website, we're gathering all this information and hope to put together kind of a general summary of what everyone is telling us on how you want to Missouri to spend this money. We understand there may not be a consensus on everything, but we're trying to get narrowed down at least, and I think we're getting there. We still have a few issues outstanding that we might need to make some decisions on. With that, I'm going to turn it over to the VW team for the presentation. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free. This is pretty informal. So raise your hand, talk into the microphone so we can hear your question and we will respond. So, okay.
With that, I'll go ahead and get started. Again, I'm Stacy Allen on the Volkswagen team with the AIR program. And today's advisory committee meeting, January 22nd, we are going to go through a couple of review type questions, some summaries.
Was there a comment on the phone?
Oh.
Yes, actually, this is Kelly Gilbert, and I apologize for interrupting, but it's hard to hear anybody but I think Kira. And the other thing is my live stream isn't working. I'm wondering if you're streaming a presentation that I just don't have access to.
Kelly, this is Stacy. Can you hear me?
Barely.
Okay. Barely? I'm on the phone.
Yeah, speak. Make sure you speak right into the microphone.
Kelly, can you hear me? Was that any better?
Yes. It's a little bit better, yeah. And
It might help if you turn the phone around to where the speaker is right in front of it.
Oh, I see.
Is that any better, Kelly? Can you hear me at all, Kelly?
That's much better, thank you.
Okay, that's better.
Okay.
Okay, we can hear you as well. Thanks for jumping in there. Van, is the live stream working?
Running.
The live stream is running, okay.
I'm monitoring it, so it's on.
Okay. If you still have trouble, Kelly, shout out. Okay, with that, I will jump into an overview of today's discussion. The first couple of bullet points we're going to go over are some review and some things that are maybe a little bit new to you. The first item is the eligibility criteria for projects. This is review and information directly from the consent decree, but we figured we'd go over that because it leads us into our second bullet point, which is equipment that is potentially eligible. So we did our best to respond to some questions we received at a previous meeting and tried to pull together some numbers. We're also going to go over emission reductions and costs of these various projects. Emission reductions were touched on at our December 7th meeting, but we've got a different way of presenting it. And then lastly, we're going to go through the second survey results. So we appreciate everyone who submitted an answer to the survey. So I'm going to jump right into the eligible mitigation action list. This list of 10 projects should be familiar if you've been to a meeting or if you've reviewed any of our information online. I've bolded a couple of these mitigation actions that we are going to discuss eligibility for. So number 1, large trucks. Number 2 are buses. Number 3, locomotives. 4, ferries and tugboats. Number 6, we're going to talk about medium trucks. Aircraft support equipment, number 7, and number 8, forklifts. So we're going to talk about those, talk about their eligibility. The other 3 were a little bit more difficult for us to come up with an inventory or to come up with more direct emission reductions. So we're not going to go in depth on those at this point. So eligibility, we've grouped large and medium trucks together here. Just to give you the overview, large trucks are Class 8, which are your largest trucks by gross vehicle weight, listed there on the slide. Medium trucks, slightly smaller trucks. There is an eligibility model year requirement here. So to repower or replace one of these vehicles has to be model year 1992 through 2009. And when you bring it up to a new replacement vehicle or just the engine, it needs to be the same year when you do your project, or it could be one previous year, model year. So those are the requirements. And the fuel options on large and medium trucks are, it needs to be a new diesel or alternative fuel or 100% electric. Those are the requirements that are outlined in the consent decree. That those are things that we could pull forward in our plan, but we would need input from this group on some of the narrowing of the focus there if we want to do that. And what I'll say about the fuel options, you're going to see that on multiple slides. Some of the fuel requirements are the same. A couple of them are a little bit different. Let's see, making sure I have everything gone over there. Move on to school, transit, or shuttle buses. These, again, have a gross vehicle weight classification, class 4 through 8. Eligible model years on this one for repower or replacement of these types of buses, 2009 and older. And I will make a note, there's no lower age limit on these buses. It can go back to the 90s or the 80s. And if you've done any projects or you've seen any of the work that Missouri DNR has done with our DERA projects and school bus replacements, DERA usually has a lower age limit, so there was a cutoff in the lower age. So some of the buses might not have been eligible under previous DERA programs. That's not the case here. So we are allowed to do as old a buses as folks may have in use right now. I will go over the same model year replacement engine, so same model year as when the replacement occurs or 1 year prior, and then the fuel options as well. You can replace with a new diesel, new alternative fuel, or 100% electric. Those are all allowed under the consent decree. Locomotive freight switchers. Again, I'll talk about these engine categories. I'm not going to go in depth on this, but a pre-Tier 4 engine is going to be an older model of engine. A Tier 4 would be anything you could buy new today. The requirement is that that locomotive freight switcher needs to operate 1,000 hours per year or more. That's to ensure that we're capturing a vehicle that's currently in service. And this engine requirement on the replacement is it needs to meet the EPA standard for the year in which the repower or the replacement occurs. So that just ensures that it's coming up to the most current standards with your replacement. And the fuel options, again, we've got diesel, alternative fuel, or 100% electric. All of those are allowed. Any questions so far? Okay. Got one? Yeah, David.
I'm trying to follow the logic here. If we have to do a Tier 4 engine, then what difference does it make? Could you go back?
Sure. Sure. So the eligible engines that could be replaced are anything that's pre-Tier 4. Right. So an unregulated engine or a Tier 0, 1, 2, or 3 are eligible to be replaced. And then you have to bring it up to the new EPA standard, which basically means you're going to bring it to a Tier 4 or very close equivalent. So I'll show you a little bit in the emission reduction slide. We'll give you an estimate of what it looks like to take a Tier 1 engine up to a current Tier 4 emission limit. So we'll show you that in a couple of slides. So for ferries and tugboats, the restriction here is that you can only repower your ferry or your tugboat. You're not allowed to buy a completely new boat. So that is also outlined in the consent decree. The engine that you're replacing can be an unregulated engine or a Tier 1 or Tier 2 marine engine, and you need to bring it up with a new engine that's either a Tier 3 or a Tier 4. The fuel options, again, same thing, diesel, alternative fuel, or 100% electric are allowed for your replacement repower. And then there are some other possibilities here. I do not know a lot of the details. Anyone that knows a lot about the EPA certified remanufactured system or the verified engine upgrade, there's probably some experts in the room here. Yeah, David?
Tugboats.
Sure.
Are Mississippi River workboats considered tugboats?
I believe so. Mark?
David, we'd probably want to make sure we review the decree to make sure, when you say a work boat, are you saying, is it hauling like a barge up and down the river?
Yeah.
Probably okay then, yes.
Okay.
Good question. All right, I'll move on to air support, ground support equipment at airports. So the restriction here has to do with the definition in the consent decree of what ground support equipment is, and that is a vehicle or a piece of equipment that services aircraft between flights. So they've narrowed the focus to just those pieces of equipment. The requirement for bringing those eligible vehicles in is they need to be a Tier 0, 1, or 2 diesel equipment, or they can also be any uncertified or certified to a certain grams per brake horsepower hour or higher spark-ignited engine. So either of those two mean that that piece of equipment could be replaced under Volkswagen Settlement Trust. And then the fuel for your repower or replacement, when you get rid of your old equipment, you do have to go to 100% electric on airport ground support equipment. So that's a little bit different than some of the other categories that we've seen thus far. All right, forklifts and cargo handlers, our last one we're going to talk about. Forklifts, the requirement is that they need to have at least 8,000-pound lift capacity, and the power or replacement, similar to airport ground support equipment, you have to replace it with 100% electric equipment. So that is a slightly different than some of the other categories that we're seeing. So. Any questions on the eligibility? That kind of sets the stage for talking about the inventory, and that was some of the questions we received at one of our other meetings. So we'll talk a little bit about our equipment inventory for those same categories we just reviewed eligibility. I'm going to take my time here. I realize it might be a little bit small on the screen, but I'm going to work my way down. You'll see the first column is our categories of equipment projects that we could do. The second column is an estimate of the Missouri equipment totals, what we think is out there. We give you the source of data in the third column where we got this estimate from or where we created it from. And then the far column on the right is our number of eligible vehicles. If we could narrow down that total Missouri equipment down to just the ones we think are eligible, we tried to put that in here as well. So I'm going to step through here and talk about large and medium trucks. We did combine large and medium trucks. DNR here at the AIR program, we did an estimate, and we see that there's probably about 188,000 large and medium trucks total in Missouri, and of those, about 115,000 are eligible based on the model years and the vehicle weight ratings. When we dove into the state-owned vehicle data, because we did get a lot of feedback that state-owned vehicles could be eligible, we asked some of our state database maintainers what could we get and find out how many vehicles might be eligible that are state-owned, and that does not include city or county vehicles, so non-municipal but just state-owned. We got about 1,500 state-owned trucks, and then we narrowed that list down to about 1,400 of those would be eligible. So I'll move down to the next category, which is locomotives. We got an estimate, again, for freight switchers, and we estimate there's about 90 freight switchers operating in Missouri, but we were not able to come up with which ones would be eligible. Keeping in mind, freight switchers are the ones that operate at rail yards. They are not the ones that are traveling long distances across our state. They stay typically in one location, and they're used for sorting trains and reorganizing long freight trains. So that's the best we could do on that estimate. If anyone has any other information, that would be fantastic. We'd love to hear it. We've got ferries and tugboats next on the list, and we asked our MoDOT counterparts if they had an estimate. They came up with an estimate of about 220 ferries and tugboats operating, Missouri, Mississippi River combined. We were not able to get an eligibility number on those, but that gives you an idea of what the universe of sources might be. On buses, we were able to separate out school buses and transit buses. I'll give you a little bit more details there. State database gave us about 6,000 school buses total in Missouri, and of those, about 3,000 are eligible. Yeah.
There are actually 12,000 buses, school buses in Missouri.
Okay, so I will say this, on our state database, this was the number that we got that were inspected by the Highway Patrol.
They
So if,
inspected 12,000 buses last year.
oh, really? We might not have gotten the latest information from them. They sent us the current spreadsheet as best we knew. So that's good to know. So that number, those numbers may need to change as well, but we'll ask our counterparts at Highway Patrol on that. So, but I would say that estimate of about half of them being eligible, do you think that sounds reasonable? And that's based on the model year of the buses. So, and then when I jump down to transit buses, I do want to.
Is it possible that
Sure.
they didn't the 12,000 doesn't differentiate diesel from gas?
Oh, there wouldn't be very many gas school buses
Wouldn't
in the
think so,
state.
but,
No.
okay.
Oh, Mark just reminded me, it could be that the contract-owned school buses may be the ones that we did not receive in our inspection
And
database.
there probably are about half the buses in the state
Oh.
that are contracted.
Okay, so that at least makes a little bit of sense to us, so we may have to ask about that.
Would
as
those
well.
buses not be inspected by the Highway Patrol?
No, they're all
Okay.
inspected.
The Highway Patrol inspected 12,047.
Okay,
All right.
that's good to know.
We'll go back and get a new spreadsheet from them. Our spreadsheet is from the Highway Patrol, so.
Yeah, yeah. And that'll affect the slides coming up too, so we want to talk a little bit more about buses, because we've gotten a lot of feedback about school buses, so that's good to know. On transit buses, though, I do want to emphasize too here, this is not all of the types of shuttle buses that you may be thinking of, so shuttle buses at airports or shuttle buses that are privately owned that take people long distances to some of our larger airports in Missouri. These are transit buses, so these are things that are operated by state or local municipal governments, and then they also receive Federal Transit Authority, the FTA funding, or any type of federal funding. So the transit bus number there is a little bit smaller than maybe what some of us deal with. So that 840 number, again, is a 2016 number. We were not able to narrow that down to get an eligible number, so it could be a little bit smaller than that. Any questions on the transit school buses? Yeah.
I would like to ask a question, actually go back to the large and medium trucks.
Sure.
That top number of 188,000 total trucks, I mean, can you give us a breakdown of that a little bit? I mean, how much of that is government, how much of that is private? Do you have that kind of information?
No. So what I'll tell you about how that estimate was arrived at, we actually have, EPA provides to states and requires states to use a mobile emissions estimate tool, which is called MOVES. And that tool is able to give us the estimated number of vehicles that are on the road by different types. So we get passenger cars, light trucks, and then we also get our larger trucks, our medium and large trucks that fall under our Volkswagen categories. The thing that tool is not able to give us is private and government-owned vehicles. It does not give us that. So that 188,000, I can't tell you how much is private and government-owned.
So that's if I hear what you're saying, and that's a number that you're using in a model, but that's not that's not data from the Highway Patrol or some other source? Okay.
No, we were not able to get that type of information, so.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good question. Any others before I move down to forklifts?
So we're not even sure if that 188,000, if it was accurate, if that's Missouri-owned vehicles or passing through? That's kind of the way it sounded, like it was just what's on the road.
It is what's on the road, so it includes both vehicles that are passing through and vehicles that operate only in the state of Missouri. It's designed to capture all the emissions that would happen in Missouri. So it doesn't matter where the vehicle is registered. Part of the problem that we run into with estimates of vehicles in the St. Louis area that we typically focus on, because it is a non-attainment area, is trying to narrow down what vehicles are registered in that non-attainment area, and then what's the mix of vehicles that are actually moving through the area that are not registered. So we do run into that quite a bit. And so using this estimate tool was the best way to capture both vehicles registered in the area and then also the estimate of vehicles that would be passing through.
I would ask if if you could speak into the mic so everyone, including those on the phone, can hear. But I also want to kind of explain this slide a little bit. I think, as Stacy has mentioned, we're trying to get the universe of vehicles that may be eligible for the Volkswagen Trust Fund settlement dollars. So based on that, it helps us, as you'll see in future slides, estimate emissions reductions from possible projects for each category. Our database and our research is somewhat limited in some areas. So if you have information, and we appreciate the updated information on school buses, so if you have information for any of these categories, just please let us know. You can share it with anyone on the team. This doesn't necessarily mean we're going to stick to the 188,000. It's a starting point to kind of start the conversation on, if we were to spend money on large and medium trucks, what can we estimate an emission reduction is? Ultimately, it all depends on who applies for each category. If we do money in different categories, who applies for that? But this is just kind of a discussion point. So we appreciate any information you might have or sources that you think that we should check for some of this. I think it is helpful, so I appreciate that.
Good questions. That's what we're here for, is to talk and get your guys' ideas and see where the interest lies as well with this group. So on forklifts, 17,000 forklifts. Again, that's from that same mobile emission estimate tool that we have. That tool does not give us a lot of information about the types of eligibility criteria. So that 8,000 pound lift capacity, that does not come out of my tool. So I was not able to narrow that down, and we weren't able to find a public source of any more specific data by state on forklifts in the area. And ground support equipment, same tool again, and it estimates about 900 pieces of equipment that would be that are total in the state of Missouri. We do not have enough information out of that tool to get a number of eligible pieces of equipment. So, best we could do at the time. Any other questions here? All right. So on that school bus inventory, keep in mind these numbers are only probably reflective of a portion of what we've seen out of our inspection database. So we estimated about 600 school districts in the state, and about 565 of them had at least one eligible school bus, and that would be 2009 or older. The average model year of the buses we were looking at came out to be about 2008. That was for the entire universe of the buses that we saw out of that first spreadsheet. Of the ones that were eligible for Volkswagen, the average model year of those was a 2005. One thing we also want to highlight here is that the tailpipe emission standards for buses changed in 2004, and there are quite a few of buses on the road that are older than that 2004 number, and that first estimate that we have is about 1,700 buses would be older than the 2004. Keep in mind that number could change. And based on some of the DERA bus projects that we've done here recently, the average cost of a new bus is coming in right around $90,000. So that, again, gives you an idea of how much do buses cost. I think that question came up here. And now I'll move on to the emission reductions and the cost of these types of projects, trying to compare these numbers. This slide you have seen before. This was at our December 7th meeting. This is a summary that was provided by NASIO. They gave us a toolkit to states. NASIO. Mark, do you remember what that stands for?
It's the National Association of State Energy Offices.
Nancy, what is it?
And there is a link at the bottom, so you can get to that product. Yeah, the National Association of State Energy Offices. So they provided a toolkit to all the states who might be working on Volkswagen, and it gave us some baseline numbers so that we could start to look at what are the emission reductions, keeping in mind emission reductions do have to be quantified in our plan. So we tried to do an apples-to-apples comparison where we could, and we tried to pick the same model year for certain project types. Like school buses, we picked a 1995, a large truck, 1995, medium truck same year. And then for the heavy equipment, we tried to pick tier 1 types of equipment so that it's trying to be an apples to apples comparison. And this shows you the amount of emission reductions that are possible in pounds per year, and that's if we did one of that type of project. So one tugboat gives you about 78,000 pounds of emission reductions. And again, we're talking about NOx, nitrogen oxides. And when you compare that to one project, say the yard truck on the right, that's only 3,700 pounds. So it gives you a way of looking at it and seeing what those emission reductions are. And the bars in the middle do stand out because they are the largest. So freight switchers, tugboats, and ferries give us the most emission reductions if we take those tier 1 vehicles and bring them up to the current standard as required by the consent decree. I'm going to flip that chart just a little bit, and I'm going to show you that same NOx reduction in blue bars on this chart, and then we're going to compare it to green bars, which is the cost per pound of the emission reduction. So I'm going to take it nice and slow here. So we're going to have our project categories across the bottom of the screen, and on the left-hand side is going to be your NOx reduction in blue, and it works from 0, and it's a negative because it's an emission reduction, so the bars are going to point downward. And then on the right-hand side are going to be the green cost per pound emission comparison there. So on the blue side, I just took and reordered those same bar charts you already saw. So we've got tugboats, ferries, freight switchers, the 3 that give us the biggest NOx reductions. And then also we combined all the airport equipment into one category, and then we've got trucks, buses, and then medium trucks as well. The bars get very small on this chart. And when I add on the cost per pound, you're going to see kind of an inverse relationship there, which is tugboats. For one tugboat to be done, it gives you a very large emission reduction. And even though those projects do cost a lot more money, they still cost less per pound to do. So it's a very low cost per ton. That green bar is very, very small on tugboat, and it does start to get larger as you go to the right. So what that's telling us is this is just one way to measure the emission benefit, and emission benefit is just one portion of our plan. This does not dictate what we will do, but this tries to give some perspective to what we're looking at on that cost per pound of NOx reduction. So this is just one of the considerations we could make. Yes, Steve.
That is comparing an old diesel engine with a new diesel engine.
Yeah.
That's not
Is that that NASIO
other,
toolkit, I believe, was old diesel to new.
any other fuel source. There are other fuel sources that would have different metrics. Would that be fair?
That would be fair. We tried to pick a consistent category where we could compare apples to apples. So in some of these categories, it was easier to compare a diesel to a diesel. So these are supposed to be uniform across there.
Thank you.
Would it be informative if we tried to get some other numbers? Do you think that could skew it, or?
I don't think there's enough colors to.
Okay. Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed on a previous slide that with like tugboats, ferries, and freight switchers, this is all on the basis, on the assumption that they're tier 1.
Yes.
Is there a reason why you chose that as the reference? Because I can tell you there's a lot of tugboats, ferries, and freight switchers that are, an awful lot of them are tier 0. I mean, we're not even up to the tier 1 standard. So
Sure.
I'm just saying, if you looked at project that's a tier 0, you're even going to get a bigger bang for the buck.
Sure, and it was to compare apples to apples. That it was just a general decision to choose about a mid-1990s vehicle. So we could recreate these if this group would like to see that information, but I don't know that it's going to change the overall decision of this group. And like I said, this is just one of the consideration that goes into writing the plan. Considering what the NOx reductions are is one piece of the decision-making pie, but it's not the only decision. So school buses, you can see, don't give us a lot of emission reductions, but we do know that they affect some of our sensitive populations. So they affect children, and they spend their time around those buses. So that's a consideration we want to put out there. This was just a way to describe the emission reduction.
the figures for the large truck, so I would think there are a lot of different kinds of large trucks and a lot of cost difference between different types of trucks. Maybe, I don't know anything about buses, but I've been on a few. Seems like there are a lot of very similar, many of them, but a lot of trucks are are very different. So how do you come up with a truck cost that uses a baseline for this?
Sure.
cost
So for
calculation?
the average truck cost, I went in and I looked at our inventory of sources that we received from our state. And so I looked at what types of large trucks are out there in that state database. And I looked to see what was out there in our estimate of the overall Missouri population of large trucks. And I looked to see what was the gross vehicle weight rating and the model years that we had. And I went in and I tried to pick about a 1995 vehicle. And I did some Google search because that's the best we had at the time. We don't have a specific database of what every vehicle costs. That's not something the AIR program has access to. So I went out and I searched a lot of those vehicle types. I also used the DERA program has a lot of reports. And so for the vehicle costs, say for the I believe it was airport equipment and ferries and tugboats, I looked to see what the cost of the projects that had been done in the last 5 to 10 years were. So trying to use as much data that's already provided by EPA or what's out there in the public sphere is what I was able to use. And so school buses, $90,000, that's something that the DNR is very confident about because we've replaced a lot of buses that we know in the last couple of years that was the cost. I will say this on large trucks, some of the other types of vehicles that we've considered and seen other states considering is fire engines, cement mixers, there's large, what we think commercial delivery trucks. Those have costs that vary widely, just like you said. But I tried to pick something that was kind of middle of the road.
Right.
I didn't pick the most expensive vehicle.
Sure, but you would agree that there's quite a difference in
Yes.
types of vehicles that
Yep.
could change this chart.
Yeah, those are all things that can change the chart. And what I'll show you next is I'm going to regroup this table just a little bit. It's still going to be blue and it's going to be red, so you're going to see NOx reduction and then the cost per pound. And so I'm going to group them into two general categories, and these are things that we talk about in the air pollution world quite a bit. And so ferry and locomotives and airports equipment on the left, that category groups those three, and I call that group non-road. And that's something that air pollution terminology, we use that quite a bit. And those are the types of vehicles, they are mobile sources, they move around, but they are not designed to operate on our roadways. On the right-hand side, you're going to see trucks and buses. Those are the things under Volkswagen that are eligible. And those are things that are, again, mobile. They move around, but they are designed for use on the public roadways. The estimation tools for those both come out of a model. But what I'll say here is it tends to demonstrate the difference between the two categories here. Non-road emissions, you generally get very large emission reductions because they're larger engines overall. And also those engines have not been subject to the same stringent emission standards that on-road vehicles have been subject to for a long time. There's also less of them overall. You saw the numbers. There's a couple hundred of some of these project types compared to hundreds of thousands potentially on trucks and buses. So you're talking about fewer projects with more emission reductions on the left for non-road, and then more projects overall for the trucks and buses on the right. And again, this is just one consideration as we think about writing the plan. I realize there's lots of folks in this room that have great expertise in this area, so if there's any other way I can help you out with organizing the information or anything else you guys would like to see, we'd be glad to try our best to get information.
And I would add again, I mean, these are all estimates based on questions that we received from many of you, just to provide you as much information as possible to try and make a decision. We in no way are trying to lean towards a decision with this information. We just wanted to present that, yes, tugboats do get you the big bang for the buck. However, there are other considerations when you talk about school buses, and we all realize that. So these are just estimates of information that we heard some of you asking for at past meetings. So.
We have a question from the web.
Okay.
Does freight switcher include yard trucks or only locomotives?
From my reading, it's just the locomotives from the consent decree. Okay, yard trucks would be Category 1 or Category 6. Okay. Any other questions? I'm about to hand it off to Mark. I'm done with talking about eligibility, inventory questions. If you think of something else at the end, feel free to ask. Thanks for all the good feedback.
Thanks, Stacy. Again, this is Mark Leaves with the Air Pollution Control Program. First, I'm going to just kind of go through a reminder of the beneficiary mitigation plan elements that are required to go in the plan that we submit to the trustee for the VW Trust. These are going to kind of hopefully dovetail nicely into the Survey 2 results. A lot of these required elements fit exactly with the questions that we asked on Survey 2, so it'll hopefully make a little more sense why we're asking the questions that we did. So there's 4 elements that every state's mitigation plan has to include per the consent decree. One is the overall goal for using the funds. I think kind of Survey 1, we asked that question directly, what should Missouri's overall goal be? So we got some feedback on that already. In Survey 2, we really focused on these second 2 bullet points. You know, what is the percentage of funds that each project category should receive? And we asked that question in 2 or 3 different ways on this survey number 2. And then also, how is the state going to consider the air quality benefits in areas that receive a disproportionate share of the air pollution burden? We asked about 5 or 6 different questions on how the advisory committee thinks that we should handle that required element of the mitigation plan. So we'll go over those results as well. We didn't really ask too many questions on estimating emission benefits, but we do have several tools that we think once we know the percentages that we're going to put towards each project category, we should be able to calculate those emission benefits in-house. So moving on, there's also 2 other considerations that we asked questions on in the survey. We've heard a lot of feedback at these meetings. So one of them is the process and the timing for actually selecting the projects. We've heard a lot of people asking lots of questions. How am I actually going to apply and receive some funding to replace a truck or a bus or upgrade an engine? So we asked a few questions in Survey 2 that deal with that question. We think that if we can put as much of those details into our plan as possible, it'll just make the whole process more transparent to the public, which is one of our goals for sure. And then finally, we've gotten a ton of feedback in all of our meetings and our comment forms online about what the preferred fuel should be in the new vehicles and the new engines that replace the old vehicles that we take off the road through the VW Trust. So we asked 2 or 3 questions about how to target those preferred fuels and what they should be. So again, Survey 2 results, let's go ahead and head right into it. We want to thank everybody that responded to survey number 2, but at the same time, I want to explain that these surveys are one tool for us to gather information. We're not just going to follow the results blindly. We're also taking into account all the verbal comments that we're receiving at these meetings, and we're taking into account all the written comments that we're receiving through our web portal. So the survey results are really great because it allows us to, analyze the data and particular answers that we get for particular questions, but it's not the only tool that we have. We're not just going to blindly follow the survey results, but they're a very useful tool, and they are going to certainly help inform the plan that we ultimately propose. So survey number 2, we sent it out just to the advisory committee. That's a little different than survey 1, which we sent out to everybody who's been attending these meetings and signed up to receive emails about the VW Trust in Missouri. This was only advisory committee members that the survey was sent out to. It was sent out in mid-January, and the deadline was January 16th. About 75% of the advisory committee responded. I think there was a total of 66 responses out of about 75 advisory committee members. And the material, like I mentioned below, was mainly to address those questions that we have to answer in order to develop our proposed mitigation plan. So the first thing we're going to look at in regards to survey number 2 is who actually responded to the survey. And this basically, question number 1, we asked every one of the survey respondents to click all the things that kind of represent their affiliation. As you can see in this, a relatively even number. However, we had a really large amount of alternative fuel advocates and EV station advocates, and relatively large amount of government personnel responding to the survey. So I think we got to be cognizant that those groups may be slightly overrepresented compared to the other groups as we walk through the survey results. And the state will certainly be cognizant of that as well as we begin drafting our plan. But we're not manipulating the results or saying anything like that. We just want to point that out. So the first real question that we asked was that bullet number 2, what % of the $41 million in Missouri should go to the various project categories that are eligible in the consent decree? And as you can see, school buses really jump out there, saying about 35% roughly of the 41 million was the average number that we received from the 66 responses that we got. And then I'm going to go ahead and group these together on the next slide and then also correlate the percentage into an actual amount of money based on the 41 million that Missouri gets, just so it's a little easier to digest. And this is what it would look like. So for school buses, 14.4 million is what that 35% roughly translates to. And then I grouped some of the other categories, tugboats, ferries, and switchers were all grouped into one category. And then large and medium trucks were grouped. We did separate it by government owned versus privately owned. So, I mean, one of the questions that we have to answer in our plan is what will the range of percentages that we're going to dedicate to each project category be? And so this is certainly a useful starting point for us based on the feedback we've gotten through Survey 2 from the advisory committee members. And as Kira and Stacy both mentioned, if you guys have questions about any of these survey results as we walk through them, please just go ahead and stop me and we'll answer them right then and there.
Mark, that
Sure.
reminded me of something. So we can update our beneficiary mitigation plan as time goes on through this 8 to 10 years, right? So we could, in the first plan, dedicate certain percentages to different types of projects. As time moves on, maybe we don't find projects in certain categories, or maybe we find more projects in others. We could revisit this amount.
Absolutely, Darcy. That's a very good
one of the many
point.
things we could revisit later on if it, okay, that's what I thought, but I wanted to clarify.
And yes, so very good point. If we want to, we can always revisit the plan and adjust some of those numbers or adjust the way that we plan to allocate the funding. So very good, Darcy. The next question asked, should we have separate application and selection processes for the various project categories so that we're not, looking at an application for, say, a tugboat and a school bus and trying to compare those two, but rather have all the school bus projects competing against each other and all the other project types competing just in silos against each other. It makes sense because we're dedicating certain amounts of money to those various project categories that we would do it that way. And the majority of the advisory committee members said, yes, it does make sense. We should have separate processes for the different project categories. So we will have to develop multiple applications in order to do this, but hopefully it'll make the applications more straightforward for everybody once they know what project they're going to do and they get the right application in hand. We can hopefully make those applications simpler for the project sponsors. The next question dealt with how should we select the projects that ultimately receive funding? And I went ahead and grouped them so that it wouldn't be such a busy slide. It's still a pretty busy slide. The blue bars there for the different project categories indicate that folks think we should, develop some scoring criteria for the applications and then score and compete each application against each other within the project category. And that predominantly across the board seems like it's the most favorable. When you look at trains and boats, we had a lot of people that weren't really sure how those should be selected, and so there were some undecided, but undecided's not really a way to select. So still, even with trains and boats, the matrix scoring method is the preferred route. The only category where there was really a close second was the EV charging stations, where maybe where numerous respondents said we should create a team to develop the projects. And a lot of the comments that we got said that, even if we are going to like try and score applications, we should at least have heavy coordination to make sure that we're not creating like redundant charging station networks throughout the state. And I think that's definitely a point that we're going to take to heart, and it makes a whole lot of sense that at the very least, heavy coordination needs to be done if we're going to pursue that project category. So, but pretty much scoring method seems like the preferred route. I will say that under DERA, the way that we've always awarded the school bus projects is through a random drawing. And even though that was not a very popular choice in our survey, it's pretty tough to grade one school against another and say this school had a better application than this school. So even though for school buses in particular, folks are saying we should matrix or score them and grade them against each other, we may decide that there's ways we can develop scoring criteria that maybe give advantages or pool applications together, but we still may go with the drawing approach there just because it's been successful and popular the way that we've done it in the past.
Mark?
Sure.
Yeah, I would suggest that maybe, I think you're saying this already, that there should be different matrix scoring methods for the different categories. Going back to like slide 18, and we've made reference to how much weight we should put on projects in non-attainment areas. Well, using tugboats and ferries as an example, those things are cruising up and down, waterways. They're not in one place. So if you were going to use a scoring method based on attainment area with them, you might tend to select ferries and tugs in St. Louis, but they're only there a small portion of the time. Versus school buses, now that's one where, it's already been mentioned here that buses are a vehicle that has a major effect on sensitive areas as far as health goes. So I think that's where you're going with this, right, is that with the different categories, there could easily be different matrices.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for clarifying there, Paul. So the purpose here was we're assuming that we're going to develop separate application and selection processes for each project category, and then within each project category, how will we do it? So, yes, school buses would have different criteria that they're graded on than, say, a tugboat and a train, and then also EV charging stations and airport equipment. So, yes, I hope that. Thanks for helping me clarify that. Do we have another question on that slide?
This is Steve Aarons. It sounds like we're locked in, and I know we've had the disclaimer several times, we're not locked in on anything yet, but it sounds like we're looking at every different category here. I know some states, I think Louisiana and Oregon have both said we're going to just go all in on school buses because of the need.
Right.
Is that still an option at this point, or are we going to divide this money up in little discrete pots and, here's my editorial comment, not do a lot of good everywhere when we could go really heavy on an area that could use it?
I think everything is still on the table. I think you're right, Steve. I think we're leading in that direction to school buses. I think most of the survey results will show that no one can argue, not very many people can argue about school buses, but I think we're not ready to say we're going to go all in or we're going to give 50% to school buses, 50% to the rest of the categories. We're still sharing the information we have, and then we're going to have some discussion after the slides and kind of open that up and see if we can narrow that down. So, Jay?
And to my colleague to my left, I would say I hope not, because that's why some of us are here. I think there are some opportunities that might be lower hanging fruit that while school buses may present a great need, and I don't discount that, there are other governmental folks who also have needs, and we would like to have some participation in the program if possible.
And I just want to follow up. The DERA option, is that folding VW into the existing? Is that is that school bus part two? What is the DERA option?
So the DEER option, I don't have my slides in front of me here, Steve, but basically since 2008, the Diesel Emission Reduction Act has been a federal grant program that states participate in order to reduce emissions from diesel fleets, and it includes pretty much every category that you see in Volkswagen. The way that the state has run their program in the last 3 years has been a focus on school buses. Whether or not that'll continue in light of the Volkswagen, I think is kind of up in the air at this point. We're still mulling over what the future of DERA should be and how we should, if we're going to use Volkswagen to supplement our DERA program, how that'll exactly work, but yes.
All right, thank you.
We did talk internally, preparing for this meeting. We've done school buses for the last 3 years, 2 years.
We've done it at least like 4 or 5 out of the last 6.
So it's an easy one under the DERA option to do. And however, there is a limit to the percentage of cost of a bus that DERA will cover, and it's lower than what Volkswagen will cover. So part of the discussion there is if we end up with school buses as a portion of the Volkswagen funds, and we say instead of 25% of a school bus, the Volkswagen funds are going to cover 50% or 75%. If we do that, then doing school buses under DERA, we're not going to get probably as much interest because they're going to want the Volkswagen funds because it's a higher percentage of reimbursement. But there are many other projects under DERA that we can choose, and some that aren't under the Volkswagen. So one of the brainstorming ideas that we had in the AIR program is if we go the DERA option, it might be a better idea to choose something besides school buses, something that the Volkswagen doesn't cover, for example, to kind of spread that money even farther than the Volkswagen settlement funds do. So,
All right, thank you.
All right, so the next survey question that we asked was how often should we open applications, take them, and then pick projects? Should we try and do it all in one single round, have one application period and dedicate all 41 million, or maybe every year or two we open up applications again and let people submit project proposals? And what we heard from the survey results, the majority said let's do it in multiple rounds. I know that government fleets a lot of times they have so much money that they have for their budgets in order to replace buses or trucks each year, and so having multiple rounds gives them a chance to replace more of their fleet, especially if there's any type of cost share involved. Plus, this also allows people more time to gather any information that they would need in order to develop an application. So multiple rounds was kind of the clear winner on this one, and I think it does make sense.
we also mentioned, I'm going to jump in for our internal discussion too, one of the options that promotes the multiple rounds, one of the reasons is if you replace, say you're going to do all of this in year one, that kind of prevents a problem with manufacturing. There's only so many school buses manufactured a year, and we don't want to cause a bottleneck in distributing the funds. So if we spread it out in multiple rounds, that will help that.
This also dovetails nicely with the point Darcy was making earlier about how we are able to go in and revise our plan. So by, doing this in different phases, if we see that something's working really well and other things aren't working so well, we could go and revise the plan in future rounds as well. So just thought I'd make that point too. The next question was kind of geographical areas to target. In the survey, we listed 4 metropolitan areas in the state. This was basically the reason we picked those areas was some of the slides we were showing in our intro meetings. These were the 4 areas where the majority of the affected Volkswagen vehicles were located. And then they're also metropolitan areas that potentially could be struggling with air quality issues and have higher amounts of diesel emissions in those areas. And the question here is, should we develop target areas, and if so, where in the state should they be? And I mean, you see kind of a widespread of, yes, we should in some of these areas, but then, the majority, just above 50% say, well, just open it up to the entire state. But we still see, big percentages saying that we should pick some of the metro areas and have some kind of a carve-out or preference for some of those areas because of the air quality benefits that we would achieve. So I think this one probably no definitive answers, but I think we definitely want to make sure we're not excluding the areas that aren't located in the metro because such a large majority say the statewide, but also maybe that we do want to be cognizant. So a lot of information to kind of digest for us here, and I think we're going to take that in and take back with us and also listen to the discussion later. And then if we decide to develop target areas based on those areas that we just mentioned in the previous slide, St. Louis, Kansas City, Springfield, Columbia, how should we target them? And I think as you can see from the slide here, the two most popular were either don't target those areas, or if you're going to, give them some bonus points on their application, so that way they have a slightly better chance of being picked if you're going to grade them against another project. There was some folks that said we should have some carve-outs and reserve some funding, but it wasn't as high as the bonus points or just the idea that we wouldn't give any preference to the areas. So the next question was kind of thinking, if we were going to reserve funding for the different metro areas, how much funding of the $41 million should we carve out and reserve for these specific metropolitan areas? And these were the numbers we got. I mean, St. Louis was just under 20%. Looks like Kansas City was about 15%, and maybe 4 or 5% for Springfield and Columbia, and the rest open up for the entire state was the result of the survey. So maybe it does make sense to have some small carve-outs for some of these areas just to make sure that a minimum amount of money goes to them. But it seems like based on the survey results, a lot of folks want to see this money spread around the state. So that's kind of the general feedback that we got on this question. And then this next question was, all right, well, if we don't really worry about the metropolitan areas or the geographical areas of the state, but instead just kind of establish target areas based on other criteria, and 2 criteria that we listed in the survey were sensitive populations. So this would be things like, emissions around schools or nursing homes or hospitals. And then also high diesel emission areas was the other thing. Should we establish target areas based on that criteria? This would be things like ports or major highway corridors or construction sites, parking lots or bus terminals, that types of thing. And I mean, as you can see, it's pretty even, but some folk, out of the 3 choices, most folks said, no, let's not actually establish target areas based on these criteria. But we did see, at least 30% for both that say, yeah, these make sense to at least consider when you're choosing the projects to actually fund. So then the next question was, well, if we're going to create areas based on the criteria, how will we actually benefit those areas? And again, just similar to the geographic areas, a lot of people either said, well, don't give them preference, or if you're going to, give them some bonus points on their application. So I think that seemed to be the consensus. And the other, let's see what this next question was, the next question here is, the trust allows a maximum of 15% of each state's total share to be dedicated to that Category 9, which is the electric vehicle charging station, the infrastructure for light-duty electric vehicles. And we asked, should we go ahead and dedicate that maximum 15% to the charging stations? That would be roughly $6 million. It would leave about $35 million for all the other project categories. Now, the majority of people said, yes, we should, but there was at least 15% said, well, give them some money, but not all 15%. And, about 35% of folks said, no, don't give them any money at all. So, I mean, even though when you just look at which bar is the highest, yes came out the biggest, but we don't want to ignore 35% of the people that just say, don't give them any. So maybe we wind up somewhere in the middle here. But I think, again, this is something we're going to take back and discuss internally about. I think we can't ignore that category, but at the same time, I think it's still up for debate on what the number should be. Steve?
Hey, is it correct that there's an entirely different pot of money for EV in the state of Missouri?
All right, so not in the state of Missouri, but under the settlement that Volkswagen, entered into the court with, for violating all these emission standards, one separate part that's completely separate from the trust was that they had to invest $2 billion nationwide into light-duty electric vehicle charging station infrastructure and education. However, there's no guarantee where that money will actually be spent. I think they're rolling out. I want to say they're doing it in either 3 or 4 phases. In phase 1, they didn't put any charging stations in for Missouri, and right now they're taking comments on how to spend phase 2 of that money. So, But yes, there's
There's a
money
resource there.
There's
Because
money that Volkswagen is
Obviously,
required.
I'm going to read that chart and say there's 55% that did not say yes. Again, just sticking up for my side a little bit.
Sure. Well, they don't say yes to the full 15%, but yes, thank you, Steve.
Mark? Yeah, just to be fair to EV charging stations, and since there seems to be it seems to be popular to take applications in phases. It seems like with EV charging stations in particular, you could open it up like to a first phase, and you could monitor the utilization of that. I'd say if you spent a certain amount of the funds towards EV charging stations, then as you go to another phase of applications, if you look and see these EV charging stations really aren't being utilized very much, then that would be a way to maybe adjust moving forward.
I think that's a pretty good point, Paul. I think with the EV charging stations in particular, I know that Pat Justice gave us a presentation. It depends on what our goal is. If the goal is to, eliminate kind of range anxiety for potential EV consumers and purchasers, then, do we want to kind of develop a minimum highway corridor, or do we want to, focus in like metro areas to spur investment in those areas in the purchase? So, I think it's a good point. There's lots of things to consider on these EV charging stations, and kind of what the ultimate goal of if we do decide to invest in them, I think is important too, and how we determine success. So, all right. The next question we asked in the survey this ties into the DERA option. So under DERA, if the state voluntarily matches the federal grant that we receive each year, then we qualify for a bonus of 50% of the amount of the federal grant. So if the grant was for $250,000 and we took $250,000 from Volkswagen and put it under the umbrella of our DERA grant, we would qualify for an additional $125,000 in federal grant money. And if we don't do that matching bonus, that $125,000 just gets divided among the other 50 states. So we asked folks, should we at least try to guarantee ourselves to get that bonus money every year? And the majority of people say yes, it makes sense that we would do that. So it may not be $250,000 a year. The amount that the state gets every year is dependent upon how much Congress appropriates, but that's a pretty good estimate for what it would take to guarantee ourselves that matching bonus for the next 9 years. And then the last few questions talk about different ways that we can target or determine preference for certain fuels of the new vehicles that replace the vehicles that we replace through the VW Trust. We asked, if we're going to prefer certain fuels over another, or alternative fuel or EVs over new diesels, how should we do it? Looks like we got a relatively large response said, well, you should go ahead and reserve a portion of money for certain types of fuels. But the biggest and most popular answer was, again, give them bonus points on their application. And this, I'll refer again to kind of that EV advocates and alternative fuel advocates, when we looked at that affiliation slide, were more represented than all the other different types of affiliations. So we're going to go ahead and take that into consideration while we look at these final slides about the fuels. Van.
Mark, going back to a question from Kelly online, EV charging, light-duty gasoline vehicles emit the majority of pollutants of all on-road vehicles. It would be interesting to see this included on the emissions and emission dollar charts.
So
this is Kelly. Thanks for bringing that up. And I don't necessarily mean for that to kind of take over the conversation, but I think it would be really interesting to see that. I know obviously the emissions benefits would be from gasoline vehicles rather than diesel emissions, but that's a piece of the puzzle that we didn't really look at as far as the charts that were included at the beginning of the presentation. I didn't realize it until kind of thinking through it just now, but thank you.
That's a good point, Kelly. I think one of the reasons that we're hesitant to put a slide up there on how many emission reductions would a light-duty EV charging station actually achieve is, we're not taking anything off the road. However, I think we can, make the argument that it'll increase market penetration. If these stations are out there, then more people will buy electric vehicles instead of gasoline vehicles. And so I think there are ways that we can calculate an emission benefit from these EV charging stations.
Right, and it would be pretty much guesswork. And I do understand that, but thought it was worth mentioning.
Thanks, Kelly.
Nice charts, by the way.
Appreciate it. All right, so moving on to the other question was, if we decide we want to reserve a certain amount of funding for the various fuels, how should we reserve it? And I mean, it looks like based on the survey results, a lot of people say we'll reserve a good chunk of money for electricity. I think, in our opinion, if we dedicate money to the EV charging infrastructure, we're kind of doing that anyway. But then, do we want to actually make sure that if folks are doing projects under, categories 1 through 8 or the DERA option, that we want to see them actually go towards electric vehicle replacements instead of new diesel or alternative fuel? That was on there. Propane was a pretty high response, but again, we're cognizant of who the world of survey respondents was, so we're not going to go ahead and just follow these blindly. I think the slide before said bonus points might make more was the most popular way to ensure that alternative and electricity get a little bit of preferential treatment over the other fuel types. We heard a lot of folks say, well, the fleet owners are ultimately the ones that are going to do these projects. Maybe we should just leave it up to the fleet owners to decide what type of fuel they want in their fleets that they're going to be actually operating. They're the ones that are actually going to be applying for the projects. So a lot of information there that, yes, Steve. All right, thank you.
One point I wanted to make here is we see propane spoken about. I understand propane is a much cleaner fuel. We also spoke about the cost per pound of reduction of NOx, and propane, just pointing out for school buses in general, is, I believe, approximately another $8,000 or $8,000 to $10,000 more for a propane bus than it is for a diesel bus currently. So, taking that into consideration, then it's going to cost considerably more to replace with a propane engine than it is with a diesel engine. So we're looking back at that cost per pound of NOx being increased for a school bus on propane.
Yeah, I think, and electricity is going to...
That's accurate. Steve Ahrens, I think you're in there. You may have better information than I do, but I think a propane school bus is anywhere from is only $4,000 to $6,000 more expensive now. Costs have gone down a lot.
That's based on a quote that I received just within the last month. So I think that number is fairly accurate. My quote was, I believe, either $13,000 or $15,000 more for a propane bus than a gas bus currently, and diesel was approximately halfway in there, so it was about $8,000 more than a diesel bus for a propane one.
But two comments. One, I don't sell vehicles, so I'm not maybe the authority here, but my thought is diesel's like 90,000, a propane bus last time I saw was like 98. CNG is about 100 and a quarter, and an electric bus is 350. So it really, and this is, for my advocation, my response to this committee has always been all fuel types. Again, that goes back to the school districts, letting them choose what works for them. So I'm mildly impressed that there's a big bar there with propane. So I don't know who that was, but I'm the one on the end, the all fuel types, and let the school district figure out what works best for them.
I was just going to add that if we do the incremental cost of the propane bus, then we also have to look at the emissions, the reductions, which I assume would be greater than changing out a diesel engine. So it may be that there's more bang for the buck, even though you increase the cost a little bit.
That is correct.
Yeah, I've been really...
Except that's kind of not what one of their slides showed at the last presentation when they compared the NOx reduction based on fuel types, because that's kind of what I weighed my decision on. They were pretty flat across the top, to be honest with you. I
Right.
realize that was, I think, a small sample, but
Right, so, I mean, in 2010, the tailpipe emission standards for heavy-duty diesels dropped by 90% from where we were at. So that 90% is going to be what you're going to get with a new diesel, and then if you're going to get a little incrementally better than that, if the total reduction is maybe only going to be, an extra 2 to 5% better if you switch to the fuel, because the new diesel standards are so tight today. And that's why I think someone had some questions for Stacy on her slide on, did we do a diesel for diesel? So we were basing that on what are the actual emission standards, noting the fact that, even some diesels and then alternative fuel and propane and electric, they do even better than what the standard is. The standard's just the bar. And so that's why we came up with the numbers that we did. And so, yes, I think because you're getting such dramatic reductions from the tailpipe, even from new diesels, that's why those bars look the way they did in the last presentation. So thanks for pointing that out.
Mark?
Sure.
So just a quick question in terms of, was there any screening that was done on the advisory, people that were on the advisory committee in terms of lobbyists that might want to load the advisory with their candidates, or did you see that happening, or?
Well, I mean, so with the affiliation slide, that's probably the best guess. I mean, in terms of was there any single company or lobbyist? I mean, there was only 66 total responses. We only sent it out to the advisory committee, and I think we have about 75 members. And so, I mean, I don't think there was a lot of loading going on. However, within the advisory committee, there tend to be a few more people that are interested in the electric vehicles and the alternative fuels, and so we got to be cognizant of that.
Eric, I'll answer. We did not screen any of the advisory committee. We've been saying all along that anyone can participate, so we've accepted everyone, and we've accepted everyone's survey.
Okay. Yeah, and my second question is related to it is, did you see partial surveys completed, so skewing it to particular answers that, like someone would skip to just question 6, answer that one, and leave the rest blank, or did people really pretty much complete the entire?
I think most people that did it completed the whole thing. I think when you read some of the comments, some people were tired by the end. I don't have time to understand this question, but but yeah, I think most people went all the way through and answered all.
Which I would say that reason alone is why we chose to only send the survey to the advisory committee, because we felt that the people who had taken the time to sign up for the advisory committee may actually finish the survey, and instead of sending it to the large Volkswagen listserv group, which I think is several hundred now, we thought we might get a few more people petering out in that larger group.
Okay. So. Thanks.
Mark? But I think this topic of alternative fuels is going back to school buses. We've shown that the economics of using the money for school buses might not be as cost effective as far as achieving goals of NOx reduction. But I think if you were to look at the options as far as alternative fuels and the scoring of school bus applications, well, then you can bring up the outcome as far as meeting emissions reductions up to that and move some good technologies along. I know in previous meetings I used Kansas City as an example several times with the several large school bus fleets that have converted to natural gas. And they have some real good numbers they can show as far as the tons of emissions that they've reduced per year in the Kansas City metro area. That's just one example. But also there's other technologies that reduce idle time in school buses and things like that, like I said, if that was added, because everybody, myself included, I would really like to see school buses, school pupil transportation helped as much as possible. And this might be sort of an equalizer if we were to consider this into the scoring for school buses. So I just wanted to mention that.
Definitely appreciate the input, Paul. And I think that was the last question. So I think, our next step is I don't think we're planning on any more surveys at this point. I think our thoughts is we've gathered just about as much information in this little initial round as we can before we actually try and draft something that takes not only the survey results, but all the comments that we've been getting, both verbal and written, and try to come up with at least a draft of a plan that folks might actually be able to react to. Hopefully it'll take all of that into consideration and appease as many people as possible. And with that